Okay, now that's a difficult question because there are lots of Nigerian poets who I think are very brilliant, and then it also depends on um, the age of the poet you're looking at. So if you're looking at, say, maybe older poets that you want to like read, so I might say you might start with Chris Abani,
Okay.
um, who I think is like one of the best contemporary poets right now outside even the Nigerian space. There's also Uche Unduka, who's he lives in New York at the moment, who is another beautiful poet, and I think why I like him is his use of like imageries and language, and he uses it in a way that's not normal, like not normal poetry, if I can use that word. Then there's also Sadiq Disikogi, who's who was part of the chapbook African chapbook box sets, and who I think is like when his book comes out, he's going to be like a very famous poet, I think. But he's also a very good poet. And I think for Sadiq, why I like his work is the fact that his work reveals the human part of us in a way that's not, that doesn't shout, that doesn't tell you to, um, it's just like fold yourself into the poem and the poem becomes you. So in other words, he shows you yourself in different parts of like different parts of your life. I think people live like every literature lives a part of the society they live in out of their work. There's really no literature or no writer that writes about everything. So every writer has a niche of which like they write from. Like for example, most of Sadiq work talks about grief, right? Um, Chris Abani talks about humanity in different aspects, be it war, be it exile. It's just like Chris Abani talks about love in a different form, right? Uche Unduka, he's all about language. So everybody has their own niche. So I think it's also unfair for writers to be like writing about everything. And so that's why you don't only have one voice, you have multiple um, poets out there. So everybody talks about different things. The Nigerian culture is rich in poetry. For example, I come from like the Yoruba speaking part of Nigeria, which proverbs and idioms are like heavy in the language. So it means like from our childhood, it's like you've been formed to think about language in a certain way. And it's not just the Yoruba speaking parts, it's also different places in the country. So you have a culture rich with myths and stories and also poems in the indigenous languages of Nigerians. So yeah, and sometimes I think also because the older people speak a lot in proverbs, so you learn a lot about how to like bend language. So poetry is a big part of Nigeria culture. It will be excess Hemphill. I can still remember um, I can still remember the feeling of reading Excess Hemphill till now. Like he was the first person I read that made me feel like, oh, I could write this thing in this way and be unapologetic about it. His poem American Wedding is fearless, it's rich in language, it's lyrical, it's everything I want a poem to be. And I think every poem I write is like, oh, it's not still as good as it's not still as good as his poems, right? So yeah, he was the first person I read, and I thought, wow, poetry could do so much more. That's always
It does it all.
It's always a difficult question when talking about English language and its influence on my poetry, because I can only talk about myself in relation to English language. I can't write in any other language other than English because I can't really write in Yoruba. I can speak a little bit, but I can write because my parents are from like two different tribes, so we weren't taught about our own indigenous language until we're like super old. So for English, a famous Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart, once said, "I've been given this language and I have to own it and but like colonize the language." So it's kind of like a recolonization of language, where language becomes, even if it's foreign, it becomes something that's domestic, right? So English for me, I don't really think or sweat about it. The way like it's not something I think about like, oh, what's this language? All I think about is the fact that because I also think in Yoruba, so it's like a translation of like writing from this form to like an English to the English into the English language, and yeah, it's the only difficulty for me is the fact that like for example, I'm here in America. I was brought up in a British education system. I'm also Nigeria, so there's like um, this factors affecting how I write. And so there's always this difficulty sometimes of thinking, oh, will people, even if it's English, but it's not English the way people think about it. So it becomes, will people understand it? But I think over like the last years, I've like stopped thinking about what people think or not think about my poetry and just write. Well, I think it's technology has started influencing poetry even right now. Like there are lots of people who came into poetry through social media, so there's a collapse of boundaries. Um, and irrespective of what people think about social media, I think it's also a nice tool to create awareness about poetry and get people to read poetry. I sincerely, I sincerely wish and hope I could say there was a thought process behind selecting those poems into a book. Um, I think until last year, I had no idea I had a manuscript in my hand. I just write, and I gave it to a friend, like collection of my poems to read, and he was like, "Oh, you could string this into a manuscript." And I, "Oh, really?" So it was, I think the work for me was knowing what poem to add and what to cut out because like most times you find yourself writing the same poem but in like three, four five versions of it. Yeah, my book cover is an interesting experience. It's a picture taken by Kamnele Chukwuobasi, who's she's a friend in Nigeria. She's a photographer and also a poet. She wanted to do she did this series about male bodies, black male bodies, and how the black bodies are expected to like be perfect and the male body is expected to be strong, to not be vulnerable. And so what she did was recreate these photographs with black men in vulnerable positions. And so I've always wanted a picture of her as my book cover. So I felt the picture was speaking to my poems. So I'm like, cool, let's do it.